We've actually got some breaking news for you now that's just come in. A court in the Netherlands has delivered its verdict on 4 suspects charged with the downing of a Malaysian Airlines flight over Ukraine 8 years ago. And we can tell you now that 2 Russians and 1 Ukrainian have been found guilty of shooting a passenger plane out of the sky, as we're reporting, over eastern Ukraine, which killed 298 people on board. Let's just have a little listen in to what's being said inside the court.
Identified. This waiting to hear if a loved one might be found also caused a delay in the grieving process. In some cases, only a small part of a loved one's remains could even be recovered. A bone of the hand, part of a leg or a foot. In 2 cases, no part of the deceased loved one could be recovered at all. The explanation of the claims by the injured parties also shows that the accused's stance in the proceedings increased their suffering, besides denying that they played any part in the MH17 crash and the fact that they were not open and did not cooperate with the investigation. They also made a number of negative statements regarding the disaster. These are all aspects that play a part in considering the amount of compensation. In its consideration of the merits, the court has found that the scope of damages has been clearly substantiated, and this scope has not been challenged by the accused. The court therefore now only needs to consider whether these claims are unjust or unfounded. First and foremost, the court finds that the grief suffered by the injured parties can in no way be expressed in money. The amount claimed is within the bounds of Ukrainian compensatory practice. Thus, the court finds that the amounts claimed for moral damages are not unjust or unfounded. Therefore, the court does not concur with the prosecution's arguments that estimation of the moral damages should be based on the Dutch emotional damages compensation decree, and a lower amount for compensation be considered than was claimed. The court therefore finds that the claimed emotional damages are fully admissible. The court will not apply the exclusion of partners of the same sex stipulated under Ukrainian law, as this exclusion contravenes laws against discrimination. The court will not include payments to third parties in the loss estimate of the claimed moral damages and will not subtract these amounts from the agreed amounts.
That was one of the Dutch judges delivering the verdict at a high-security court near Schiphol airport, from where flight MH17 departed on the 17th of July 2014, and as we said, 298 people on board. Let's speak to our correspondent Anna Holligan, who's been following the trial. Anna, we were just hearing there from that judge who was talking about the bodies that had been recovered. Quite horrific detail there, but what we do know is that the verdict has been delivered, 3 guilty and 1 acquitted.
Yes, this has been a painful experience for the families, many of whom are packed into this courtroom listening to the verdict. An interesting judgment from the judge here. He began by explaining why this could be considered an international conflict, which was a reminder for so many that Russia's invasion of Ukraine started 8 years ago rather than 8 months ago. The families here have been waiting a long time for this. You may be able to hear planes in the background. We are within sight of the runway from which MH17 departed. The judge ran through a summary of the evidence. He talked about the missile fragments found in the body of some of the crew. He talked about piecing together this kind of jigsaw. And for the families, what's most important isn't the presence of these accused, now 3 found guilty, 1 acquitted, but actually the process of gathering the truth and for the world to see what really happened that day.
Yeah, that's right, Anna, because there was so much misinformation that came out, so many denials. And so while you say none of these men are in court today, it's more about the truth coming out. And for the families, I suppose, and you've been following this very closely, some form of justice.
Exactly, and the relatives I spoke to just before this hearing said that their loved ones were among the first casualties of a conflict which is still raging today. One of them, Hans de Borst, he lost his 17-year-old daughter, Elsmeek. He is here today. Another one, Barry Sweeney, his son, 28-year-old Liam, was also on board. Every family has a story of loss, and actually the judge began the hearing today by talking about the impact it had had on them and the important part they were able to play in these proceedings, because we heard so many of the victim impact statements during the course of this trial. And so many of the families have told me over the years that the first disaster was, of course, the crash, the fact that this plane was brought down by a surface-to-air missile supplied by Russia, as the judge today has said, and fired from territory which was at the time controlled by Russian-backed separatists. But the second disaster, the second blow for the relatives, was the disinformation that was pumped out in the aftermath of this crash, which has made it harder for them and for the world to know the truth. And so actually a huge part of what this trial means, what justice means to them, is that this really clear picture has been painted of how the events occurred. And the amount of evidence that the investigators had access to, from phone intercepts with some of these men who have been found guilty today, satellite images, videos, telephone calls, videos, social media posts, eyewitness accounts. There is no doubt, the judge here said today, that these three men were guilty. But actually, this is the closing of a chapter, but the story will continue because the investigation continues. They are still trying to trace the person right at the top of the chain of command and identify the person at the bottom who actually pressed the button to release this missile.
Yeah, I mean, when we have a moment to just pause and think about 298 people on board that flight, all packing to go away on holiday from across the world, you know, boarding that flight and getting caught up in a geopolitical crisis and a war that was raging, you know, as they crossed that area.
There are so many difficult elements in this case. I mean, one is the fact that the airspace above this part of eastern Ukraine, which we are now all so familiar with, had recently been restricted to 32,000 feet by Ukraine because the conflict on the ground had escalated recently into the air.